This is the second in our climate change speaker series. Last week we had Jackie Patterson from the NAACP and Mina Maxey from Zero Waste Detroit. Hopefully, if you were here, you enjoyed the experience. Their comments last week really set the stage for things that we're going to be talking about throughout the rest of this speaker series. Among the things they highlighted was that environmental justice is directly and inextricably linked to racial, economic, and gender injustice as well. And that Black Lives Matter campaign is just as much about environmental injustice as it is about social injustice, both in the US and abroad. And so today we're going to continue that discussion with Cindy Wiesner, who has a very storied history of working in these social movements, in climate change, and in other movements that cross all of these different areas that we've been talking about. She is an organizer earlier on and a member of HERE, the union HERE, for almost 2 decades. And she has been involved in many campaigns and organizations in San Francisco and Oakland, California. She served on the board of directors of the Youth Empowerment Center and the Women of Color Resource Center, both also in the Bay Area. She's currently the program coordinator of the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, an organization that is essentially an umbrella organization for a lot of smaller environmental justice organizations in the US and some abroad as well. And so she has, as the leader of as the program coordinator of the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, been a representative at the US Social Forum and at the World Social Forum. She has also recently attended the conferences in Lima, the side conferences to the Lima negotiations on climate change that were held by the UN and Convention on Climate Change, the Convention on Climate Change. So this Lima meeting that took place in December followed from a series of international conventions about climate change and what to do about environmental issues. These started back in the early 1970s in Stockholm in the Conference on Humans and the Environment, proceeded through the Montreal Protocol and about greenhouse gases and chlorofluorocarbon emissions, CFC emissions, in late 1980s, and then to Rio and the conferences on environment and development in the early 1990s, Kyoto in the late 1990s, Johannesburg in the early 2000s, and then more recently in Copenhagen, Mexico City, Doha, Lima, and then this coming September in Paris. There will be another framework convention on climate change to discuss what needs to be done in the future at that intergovernmental level. While that all has gone on, however, there's been more popular movements at work. And that started back in the 1970s with a lot of increasing interest in the relationships between environmental justice and development. But more recently, in the late 1990s, with protests against the WTO, IMF, and World Bank. And then also there have been side conferences to both the Lima conference back in December and conferences for the past decade as well. And Cindy Wiesner has been a part of those conferences. So we're going to hear her perspective today as someone who has attended a lot of those side events and organizing local and global organizations for campaigning for the environment, and somebody who has worked with creating these alliances between local organizations, both in the US and abroad. And we're going to hear a little bit about her criticisms of the intergovernmental process and about the needs for more local organization and more local organizing and the global alliances that can be forged against the inefficiencies of the intergovernmental system. So with that, we're going to give it over to Cindy Wiesner. Again, she's going to talk for about 40 or 45 minutes, and we'll have about 15 minutes of discussion, question and answers for Cindy. And then we will come back after that Cindy will leave us in a room at 5 o'clock, and then we'll have a discussion around ourselves about the things that she's talked about, and hopefully for those of you who were here last week, about the things that we talked about last week and some of the connections that we can make between them. Also, so you know, there will be soon a questionnaire posted on the Global Studies website about this speaker series. So if you have it, we would like you to fill it out, get some feedback from it. We will let you know more details about that as it goes on, but you can check out on your own when it's up there. Okay? So thank you very much, and thank you, Cindy, very much for coming. We're very glad to have you here, and we're glad to hear all of the things that you've experienced and worked with, and especially excited to hear about what came up in Lima and what's going on now and what to look forward to for the future. So thank you very much.
Great. Can you all hear me? Hello? Yeah, you can. Okay. So, hello everybody. Thank you for having me. I want to apologize for the noise. I'm actually in a meeting here in Washington, D.C., in which actually it's a post People's Climate March meeting, and they just went on break. So I'm really sorry for the background noise. One, I just really want to thank Jackie Smith and a lot of the department that invited me to be part of this series, and has invited a lot of my colleagues, both from local organizations and national organizations, to have a discussion and share some of our thinking and some of our work. And Jackie had asked me to talk a little bit about the work that's happening on the international level, but also the movement building work that's happening locally, and that's happening across the world. And so, one of the things that I want to just start off with, thank you for also the bio and the introduction. It's really the story of Grassroots Global Justice Alliance. So I'm actually the national coordinator of this alliance that actually was born out of the World Social Forum process. So many of you may know that the social forum process was actually a process that social movements started probably about 12 years ago in response to the Global Economic Forum that happens on an annual basis in Davos. And part of this process of social movements coming together, was the first social forum was hosted in Porto Alegre, Brazil, and really made it a call out that, if the big, big global leaders, the big kind of corporations, the big kind of capitalists are coming together on an annual basis to figure out, how to deal with war, how to deal with the economic sort of recessions, how to deal with policies on a global level, that social movements also needed to come together. So Grassroots Global Justice actually started as us taking leaders, frontline leaders, indigenous leaders, leaders, organizers working on issues of immigration, on NAFTA, labor leaders, and really began to engage in a process with our counterparts, right? Because part of what we found at the World Social Forum was all these, major organizations that were in a lot of ways our counterparts, indigenous peoples, women, students, youth, campesinas, campesinos, in really being able to have a scale of movement that was way bigger than anything we had ever seen, and then also really contending in a lot of ways for state power. And so I think that was one of the things that really became something that was inspirational to the people that went and saw those folks, because there was two things. It was one, we saw movement building at a whole different level internationally, but we also, many of the people that while we were there would ask us, well, what are you all doing about your government? Your government, and at that time was President George Bush was in power. And part of what they were saying is your government has a deep influence in terms of policy, in terms of war, in terms of resources. And we want to be able, what are you all doing to hold your government accountable? Because so much of what happens in the world is kind of dictated by U.S. foreign policy. And so we then, in 2005, basically founded this alliance of grassroots organizations, but also national networks, groups like Jobs with Justice, Indigenous Environmental Network, the National Network of Immigrant Refugee for Refugee and Immigrant Rights, and community-based organizations, and also independent worker centers like the Miami Worker Center, or independent unions like the United Electrical Workers. And so the basis of unity of this alliance was really on purpose to be multiracial, multi-sectoral, but really around this vision of movement building, and to really deal with the causes of what the movements back then were calling neoliberalism. And to this day, that's a component, right, of the dominant economic system that we live in, is really being able to talk about what is neoliberalism, not only the impact internationally, but then the neoliberal project within our communities here in the United States. And so, so that is the work that we've done in a lot of ways, trying to make interventions around NAFTA, CAFTA, the trade agreements, around global issues around globalization and migration, and then also environment and climate. And so part of that work had led us to really help think about this question. It's like, in terms of movement building, we played a huge role in helping along with many other allies and many other partners, helping organize the first U.S. Social Forum, one in Atlanta in 2007, and then the second one in 2010. And the basis of this was really critical and important, because it was important to be able to begin to articulate what a resistance movement in the United States really looked like. And I think there was so many fights happening on across the U.S., but there was a way in which we were siloed, around sort of like whether you were working within the immigrant rights movement, the environmental justice movement, the worker movement. And part of what the U.S. Social Forum really began to do was create a space of movement convergence, and bringing together kind of our different struggles, and really looking at places where we actually had points of agreement, points of alignment, and really clear about the kind of vision of the world that we wanted to build, right? And so I think that I just wanted to share a little bit of context of a little bit about the organization that I get to work with. I have the privilege and honor to be able to work with, because we really see ourselves, one, as a bridge builder, both amongst organizations here in the United States around that transformative vision, but also with our international partners, because of that sort of important piece around building those links, right, between the movements here in the United States and then big social movements that are happening around the world. And part of that is, we call this a concept of grassroots internationalism, which is a little bit of an update on, most folks have known within the U.S. we've had a very deep history of solidarity movements with different, anti-intervention struggles in Central America, solidarity struggles against the anti-apartheid movement, solidarity struggles, go way back, against fascism when in the war in Spain. And so our country has very rich history of solidarity. But one of the things that we started to think about, and particularly as what we call communities of color, working class white communities, impacted communities, we said that, ultimately what we needed to build was a little deeper than solidarity, that it was really about kind of a joint struggle framework, and that ultimately that joint struggle framework really brought together where we saw common targets, common enemies, or a system that really sort of was not only impacting people around the world, but also here. And so that's a principle that and a value that we really uphold, is this concept of grassroots internationalism. And so that and it takes me to, so we started actually taking delegations to the UN conference, the what they call the COPs, the Conference of Parties, and basically part of that was our first delegation was in 2008 in Copenhagen, where we took again groups from impacted communities like working class folks from Appalachia. Indigenous people struggling around mining issues, communities impacted by industrial facilities, or like or nuclear energy facilities, or oil refineries and things like that. And we felt that it was really important to be able to bring that voice, right, to these global arenas. And part of that, in 2008, there was actually a lot of excitement, and a lot of people felt that, if you all remember, President Obama was just elected, and there was a huge mass mobilization that made that happen. And as we were then going into the UN negotiations, we were very hopeful that something was going to happen very differently at this level. And what was actually really terrible and really sad was the outcome of Copenhagen, which some people kind of coin as Nopenhagen, because really nothing happened. In fact, what happened was that President Obama came in at the 11th hour and really, in a lot of ways, set us back, right, in terms of not having any binding agreement. In fact, making deals with what then at that point was like the emerging sort of developing countries, what now is being called the BRICS, Brazil and Russia, India, and South Africa. And I think in a lot of ways, the movements that had been doing a lot of lobbying and a lot of actions, both on the inside of the UN process and then at the outside of the process, were really just disappointed. We're very disappointed by what had happened in Copenhagen. And so as a result of no real binding agreement that had happened, basically, hold on a second, my colleague, you can hear me? Oh, all right, guys. All right, I'm going to try. Sorry, they can hear me in the other space. So I'm going to try to be, hopefully you guys can hear me. So out of that process, I think that President Evo Morales of Bolivia, so disappointed in what hadn't happened in Copenhagen, called for a world meeting of social movements in Cochabamba in Bolivia, and really was to really begin a bottom-up process to come up with what would be our vision of what would solve the climate crisis, what would solve the economic crisis, what would be things that we would see as solutions towards the issues that we were dealing with. And that those of us who got to participate in Cochabamba ended up being, it was a very life transforming sort of moment and event, because basically that we were able to create a blueprint for what we felt was needed in the world. But I think that was something that was completely outside of the UN process, and that was something that ultimately hasn't been taken into account in any of these UN negotiations. But I think it is a blueprint that I think a lot of us have in the movements internationally and here in the United States, we uphold as something that has been very, very powerful. We went on to Cancun, and again, there sort of more and more just disappointment in the processes that are happening. Where a lot of times the developing countries are bullying and sort of impacting the developed countries are bullying and impacting developing countries. And I think that you see this dynamic time and time again. And so I think that part of what was, interesting is that more and more social movements have chosen to create alternative spaces that are parallel to the process, and then where basically we come up with places where we do education, where we do strategy development, where we take action, and where we sort of create a process in which, again, we're trying to lift up what we call the permanent solutions, the long-term solutions that are really going to be dealing with this. And so I think that that's been one of the positive outcomes of these spaces, is that people have utilized this as a way to be able to build up sort of our power in that. And then I think you saw this happened, in terms of the UN Climate Summit that happened here in the United States on September 23rd. Did any of you actually get a chance to go to New York? Can I see a raise of hands? Anyone took local actions there in your local hometown on that day? Raise your hands. All right, very good. So I think that part of that is that, there's been this growing movement that I think is beginning to really have an integrated perspective, right? Around like that that climate is no longer something that the environmentalists are sort of dealing with. That climate is something that is intersectional with the economy, that is ultimately something that impacts, when we think about migration, when we think about issues of poverty, when we think about issues of even war. It's like so much of that is going to be impacted by the climate crisis. And so I think that we saw an unprecedented amount of people mobilized on the streets of New York City and also around the world on September 21st, in response to really saying, we, from like a whole set of different movements, from a whole set of of points, really beginning to say that we need to do something, and it's going to take all of us to actually make this change. And I think that that's pretty much where I think we're now left with. This moment is like, where do we go from here? There, the the road to Paris is in December, November and December of this year is going to be the next conference of parties. And, this will be the 21st year of this conference of parties. And in a lot of a lot of our perspective, nothing's really changed in the last 20 years. In fact, things have gotten worse. And so there's a lot at stake at the negotiations in Paris. And I think that part of what we're trying to really think about is what are strategies to have influence both on the inside and also outside of the UN process. And what are the things that we already know are solutions, and what do we know that are also alternatives that are actually, we don't always have to depend on the UN processes. But I think that one of the realizations is like, how can we basically we do need an agreement, and I think that's part of the meeting that I'm here at right now with after the People's Climate March, with a lot of the organizations and folks that did work around that. It's like, what are we going to do to get some of these binding agreements? And so I think that's one of the things that I think a lot of us have to be able to think about. It's like, what does this UN process have to do with us? And then what are entry points in which we can actually make some impact? So with that, I want to talk just a little bit. One of the other questions was then, why is it that, we've been doing a lot of this work on the outside? Is, it's like, I think in the last decade, we've really seen what I would call the development of kind of new protagonists. It's not that they're not. We've always been in the movement, but this raising of people speaking up for themselves, and people really organizing themselves in a very visible way. And I think you've seen a very strong sort of visibility of that leadership through both on the inside of the UN processes, but also on the outside. And that's really been like very clearly Indigenous peoples. So Indigenous peoples of the Global South and the Global North, really utilizing this process to talk about treaty rights, to talk about the rights of nature, to talk about the rights to be able to stay and be stewards of the land, in a lot of ways, protectors of the land, and really almost bringing a kind of a new cosmovision about relationship to place and relationship to each other, with a lot of the concepts of, it's called in Spanish, it's called buen vivir. But it's this Andean concept of really a new way of relating to the earth, to each other, to even questions of even the economy. We've seen the rise of women and the leadership of women in a lot of ways, particularly Indigenous women, Campesina women, and as also being able to talk about, it's like, how can we have this intersection of climate and women's right, and really looking at feminism again, like an eco-feminist view of it's like, in terms of really thinking about what's at stake, and then how do we, when we think about solutions, to this climate crisis, how are we thinking about it from a feminist point of view? How are we thinking of it from a place that, usually the worst and first hit are, low-income communities, oftentimes women and children bearing the brunt of it. I think we've seen the rise of what I would call low and no wage workers, and basically being able to see this whole new sector of workers that are not always been historically even recognized even by unions, but folks like waste pickers, domestic workers. Workers that are sometimes outside of the traditional economy, and then being able to have play a key role in terms of when we're thinking about sort of the way the world, the economic system functions, like their particular role that often gets invisibilized. The role of campesinas, farmers, and sort of seeing again the folks oftentimes at the forefront of climate change are farmers, are peasants, are people who work the land, who are seeing the extreme droughts, who are seeing, the impact of GMOs, of massive companies like control, like Monsanto, and at the same time building up very vibrant militant formations and organizations, and really making so one of the biggest organizations actually in the world is Via Campesina, which is an international peasant campesino movement made up of 200 million families worldwide. And then I think the last sort of protagonist that I would say is then like countries from the global south, where you see them playing a key role, like Bolivia, Venezuela, Brazil to a certain extent, playing a key role in these global negotiations as a counterpoint to, for example, the U.S. and a different perspective. And so I think that has been a very important development globally, but also in the US, in terms of really then beginning to change the face of the movement, both the environmental movement, but also globally, because I think part of that has been, again, either different ways of even thinking about campaigns, different ways of thinking about framing, or even how to be able to think about the outcomes of what people are wanting, and I think one of a cool kind of slogan that the Via Campesina puts out is that farmers, small farmers cool the planet, and that there's actually, studies done and sort of statistics that if we actually localize our food production, that would actually be a way to be able to cool the planet. And so I think that part of what we're just seeing is so many of the solutions to this climate crisis on the meta level are happening at very localized levels, and oftentimes by the people most impacted. So with that, I think that the last thing I'll say, and I'll just kind of open it up for questions, is that the in the U.S., the environmental movement has been pretty mainstream and has been pretty like kind of institutionalized in a lot of ways, and has been overwhelmingly white, or focused on narrowly focused on very specific issues or around conservation. And part of it is that we have been seeing, and I think part of the example of the People's Climate March in New York City is that was one of the most dramatically different marches around climate and the environment that has ever happened in history. And I think that's because of the work that I think a lot of communities have been doing on the ground, a lot of what I call the new protagonists, really being able to also say we got to be able to build these, sort of cross-sectoral, cross-class alliances, and often on a tactical level. But I think being able to kind of build unity from a new point of view, right? Because I think a lot of us, so what we've really seen is that, none of us have been able to have impact, whether it's been the direct action community, or the large NGOs, or even the environmental justice communities. And I think that part of what we're seeing at this moment is that if we actually unite, even across difference, there is actually much more power there. And I think we're seeing this here in the United States. We're seeing that globally. And I think that that's one of the most hopeful things that I think from my vantage point that I could see and I could share with you all. It's actually a very hopeful moment in the movement right now. But I think that that's one of the things that I'm very sort of excited about to be able to just share with you is that, it's almost like we say like the movement starting to move. And I think that we're also starting to move in a different way where we really, honor relationship building, trust building, demand development that respects our different perspectives and that we struggle around that. And I think that that's one of the things that I would say is also a feature of this time that I think we learned from specifically the People's Climate March experience. So I will stop there and sort of just take any questions or comments. It'd be great to also hear from you all in terms of what you're seeing in terms of the sort of the local to national to international movement building.
Well, first, thanks. All right, is there anybody that has a question they'd like to start off by asking? Yes, go ahead. And I think if you just stand up and talk loud enough, she should be able to hear you.
Hi. Just full disclosure for everybody, I worked at the UN for many years, so I very much appreciate our speaker's explanation of the complicated processes that sometimes sound incredibly bureaucratic around really important issues. But my question to the speaker, from that position of having been both inside large organizations and then more on the grassroots side, one of the greatest challenges I've seen is that while the grassroots can mobilize, sometimes there still seems to be a disconnect that the processes don't hear them. Mm-hmm. How do you address that issue? And I see that happening domestically in the States, and I see it happening internationally, where there is more of a mobilization effort and it's more organized, but it still does not seem to be building that bridge that would influence the policymakers and the process people. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. Do we want to take a couple more questions or?
Sure. Either way, whichever way you want to do it. If there's anybody else have a question? Else? Okay. Well, let's just start off with that one, and then hopefully there will be some more. Sure.
Great. All right. Great. So I think that's a great question, and I think that one of the things is that. I think that that's actually one of the reflections that we've been having today in today's meeting, that part of what, there was 400,000 people in the streets of New York City, and globally, there was over 162 actions that happened simultaneously across the world. And in a lot of ways, I think there was some level of influence in terms of at least the recognition from the UN General Secretary Ban Ki-moon around, that a massive amount of diverse cross-section of society and what we would call like civil society was actually in the streets demanding climate action. And, and I think even President Obama in his address to the UN Climate Summit on September 23rd, recognized the mobilization. But I think that what did it actually have any impact on the policy? I would say no, right? It was interesting what happened on September 23rd. There was like a closed door meeting, a closed door luncheon that happened at the UN around a lot of the corporations, folks like BP, McDonald's, Coca-Cola, and basically they were all at this luncheon and they were all basically saying, we're going to reduce emissions. We're going to reduce emissions. We're all for this, green way forward. And I think in a lot of ways, that's a very slippery slope. And in fact, in my opinion, and a lot of social movement opinions, like very dangerous, right? And I think a lot of us have kind of called out the kind of corporate greenwashing that's actually happening, and that in a lot of ways, the green market or the green economy is kind of a new way in which capitalism is reinventing itself. And so I think that there is a very deep stronghold in terms of an agenda around, the economy, global economy, sort of resuscitating itself through the use of green, painting it green. And I think that part of what I think we have to think about are what are effective strategies that we actually use, that we can't wait until the UN negotiations happen, because by that point, most everything is what we call baked. Everything's kind of already baked. And I think that part of what we have to look at is what are points of intervention within our own countries, as the negotiations are happening, right? What are policies where, for example, right now, Obama put out, and the EPA put out this clean power plan. Like, what is it that we can do to impact agreements like that, and so that it further reinforces what it is that we want to have be the kind of position our own governments have. And so I think that it's a multiple strategy. It's what are we doing in our countries to impact the negotiators or the representatives that are at that level. And then I think once we're there, what are strategies that we're developing as a movement, nationally and also globally, around the impact that we could make. I think a lot of people already are thinking that the UN negotiations in Paris are not going to come up with a good deal. And I think that that's some of what we're talking about, is like, what is it that we can actually have as a stronger strategy across different communities, right? Both coming from the traditional NGOs, the big green organizations, labor, and then folks from the direct action community, and then the environmental justice movement.
I have a question about how do you think, how big of a role do you think media plays in your strategy for, especially for some of these cross-sectional communities cross-sectional campaign movements that you talk about? One example is the Pepsi conflict in India over the polluted water situation in a particular farming community. The only reason why Pepsi even made any adjustments is because of how much clout and how much forcefulness the community has raised. And there was a particular party in India that tends to be a little aggressive in their movements, and they tended to bring a lot of media attention because of how aggressive that party is. And so that's the only reason why Pepsi decided to pay for the farming community's cleanup of that area. Now, as for the prime minister at the time, he didn't make any kind of movements as to what, as to making any kind of statements against Pepsi, or to actually making any kind of movements in the UN to support climate change. So how do you propose that we make it on an international scale using media for our purposes?
Yeah. Yeah. So great question, and I think great example. I think in a lot of times, I think part of an important strategy is both. It's how do we talk about the organizing and the base building, right? That I think is necessary. What we call building our power base, right? So organizing the impacted communities to be able to come and put pressure, right, in terms of taking on, different forms of action, different forms of pressure tactics around that. So I think that's a very important component. And I think the other piece hand in hand with that is what is a communication strategy that is multidimensional. And I think, and again, in the last 15 years, the development of social media and technology to be able to aid and accompany that organizing strategy is very important, because I think what we see in that case that you brought up is really, shame, or like the shaming campaign, right? Is putting the spotlight on the corporate polluter, and then being able to walk hand in hand with with sort of creative direct action. I think in a lot of ways, I think that's what's very important. Oftentimes, I think what's unfortunate, oftentimes, is that we see, sort of the media and sort of whole infrastructure is not geared to tell people stories, right? Is not geared to tell sort of the progressive or left example, right? And I think in a lot of ways we see a dominance of, sort of the counter narrative. And so I think that's where a lot of our organizations and a lot of our movements have created actually alternative forms of media, right? Alternative forms of media to tell our story, to lift up those places where we've had successes and victories. But, I think one of the things that's been so important, and, and I think mentioned earlier, like sort of the Black Lives Matter, movement, the Occupy movement, like in a lot of ways, there's just been a tremendous, it's because, technology now is also so accessible, and there's a way in which we can be able to tell the stories pretty immediately in a much more kind of decentralized way. And so I think there's just a lot of different ways that we can look at information dissemination, but also how is it that we can also create ways in which we have mainstream impact. It was actually the People's Climate March, it got, the front page of the New York Times. It had, sort of coverage, but overall it wasn't a story. It's like the Tea Party has like, 600 people at one of their conventions, and it has like news for days. And I think that you still see obviously a slant in terms of what the at least the U.S. media prioritizes. And so I would say that that's a challenge that I think we still need to think about, is that organizing in hand with and lifting up those local stories to really put the spotlight, like I said, on the dirty energy or dirty polluters, the polluting industries that have all this impact on people's lives and communities.
Hi, Cindy. It's Michael. I'm off camera, but I think for you anyway. My question is this. You mentioned that in the U.S. context, at least, the environmental movement has largely been, or at least historically been, until recently, a fairly middle-class, conservation-oriented type movement, right? So then you also mentioned the importance of this movement-building process, developing these collaborations with, other grassroots groups, other activists, impacted communities, and so on. So my question is about where those things sort of come together or don't. How important is it to include in this sort of growing coalition or collaboration of people part of that more mainstream traditional movement? And what are the particular challenges of trying to build a movement that crosses between, say, impacted communities and this much more, again, historically white, middle class, maybe more conservative in a lot of ways, group?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that one of the things that I think has been important, and I know I keep referring back to the People's Climate March, but I think there's something very there's a lot of lessons in that process, because I think that could have been a march that would have gone down traditionally like any other environmental march, and I don't think it would have been as big, and I think it wouldn't have actually had the kind of the breadth and depth of what we were able to see happen there in terms of the cross movement sort of representation. I think that there was a decision, and we started talking about the UN Climate Summit, when Ban Ki-moon announced that summit, a year ago, when a year and a half ago, and I think that then organizations started having conversations, and 350.org and avaz.org began to sort of consult with other organizations, and in terms of trying to say, should we do something? What should we do to actually impact? The question to the sister who brought up that question is like, what do we do to impact? This summit that's going to happen. And I think it made that there was some interesting decisions that were made that were very different. One, I think that there was a reach out to the Indigenous Environmental Network. There was a reach out to the Climate Justice Alliance that we're a member of, and there was a reach out to local environmental justice organizations in New York and New Jersey. And I think that in and of itself was a very good first step. That one, it was like before the plans were kind of all drawn up and say, hey, we're doing a mobilization, and then inviting other people along the way. It is actually something that folks were kind of invited in terms of one, the co-thinking and the co-planning in the process from the get, I would say. I think the second thing, there was a real kind of we from the global justice movement refer to the Jemez principles. And the Jemez principles were actually the principles that were written up, I believe, in 1996. And these Jemez principles were based on actually a reaction to the anti-globalization movement and the sort of same dynamic where the anti-globalization was, sort of white-led, and it was kind of more, that movement was more on the like sort of action faction tip. And part of that was that there was a lot of negotiations that also were that there was negotiations happening where Beltway kind of groups, primarily here in Washington, D.C., were making all these agreements without actually consulting, or getting informed by groups that, for example, in the border, who do work in Texas or in California. And that where you were seeing kind of the direct impact of the trade agreements, for example. And so these Jemez principles some of them were about, sort of like just principles of engagement. So what did it mean to actually create framing around, people speaking for themselves, right? That we didn't need kind of intermediaries speaking for us, and that we wanted to create tables or processes where people were speaking up for themselves. The second thing, that we wanted to have, be inclusive, that we wanted to be able to have a movement in which, based on mutual respect and solidarity. And so these principles actually were back up in the planning process for the People's Climate March, and they were really used as a way to be able to get a sort of unity in how we were going to make decisions, and how it was going to look. And so I think that was a really transformative experience for all of the groups that involved. So from the Sierra Club to the local groups, EJ groups, to like I said, the direct action community folks that ended up doing work around Flood Wall Street, to a lot of even the unions, right, and CJA. And so I think that was actually something that I think is a new practice of saying, what does it mean for all of us to be at the table in a very different way? So I encourage you all to look it up, check them out. I think that there's some principles that are very basic, but I think are very powerful. And I think that's going to be, I think we're in this process of really recalibrating what the traditional environmental movement looks like, and to be able to say that all of us care about climate, all of us need to do something about it. And I think that's something that I think is this kind of new hopeful moment that we're in.
Thanks. All right, I think we have time for one more question. Sage.
Hi. I don't know if I'm on the screen or not.
Yes, I see you.
Okay, great. We all know that the environmental movement is definitely diversifying. But one thing I've kind of been noticing, and it came to my attention last year in the Student Environmental Conference Power Shift, where even, they were very inclusive, kind of heralded diversity and had very diverse speakers. If you look at actual power breakdown, it was still, your classic, typically white males who were the head of these major organizations, the ones with the financial clout, where, a lot of the diversity in the movement is much more small-scale organizing and not necessarily that big political power. Do you see that shifting at all, or do you see that it's definitely lagging behind the movement as a whole? And what kind of do you see as ways to fix that problem?
So yes, good observation, a correct one, and I think we're trying to really be mindful of, right? Because I think so. There's two things. I think it's not only about the issue is not just also about diversification of the movement. The issue is more also about it's like what kind of leadership are we? It's like this. Are we trying to do the same thing? Are we applying the same strategies that haven't actually worked, right? And part of that is just because you're a person of color or you're a woman doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be transformative in your approach, right? And so I think that part of that is that, I think many of these groups have, sort of created, EJ departments or EJ programs and, recruited, people of color or women to do the work. And so, but then there hasn't been sort of that structural shift within those organizations. And I think that there are processes happening now, which I'm happy to share with you, that people are looking at, sort of institutions that are really looking at like, okay, like it's a problem that, we're, 95% white, and what do we do about that? And what does it look like? And then what's the kind of also internal shift that even happens with, for example, the white staff, or the white membership. And so I think that it's interesting to kind of see these conversations happening internally, but also across the movement. And then there's also ways, I think, in which, as people of color or impacted communities or as folks either been marginalized outside of these processes, like there's ways in which we're also having these conversations in a way that help promote sort of be clear and struggle through it, but then they're not always divisive, because I think that's the other side of it. It's like, how do we engage with difference and struggle in a way that kind of builds, but and doesn't destroy, each other? How do we not tear each other apart, and in the movement? And I think that's one of the things that has also been really good when you have these principles, that you try to also hold yourself to that. But I think that that's a longer term process, because I think right now, there are, I'm happy to say that there are some at least levels of self-awareness of talking about what that looks like. I think the other piece to that is like, how do we also raise the level of leadership that happens on the ground, sort of like the folks, from the Gulf Coast who've been fighting, the BP oil spill, or it's going to be the 10-year anniversary of Katrina. It's like the indigenous people and the ranchers being impacted on the tar sands and the Keystone XL. Communities that are impacted by, oil refineries and coal power plants. And I think that that's one of the things that's been exciting, is how to be able to raise the leadership, and not only in a tokenistic way, but also like the critical leadership of, the strategic leadership, the tactical leadership of being able to say, this is what we think, as movements coming from those impacted communities, what we can actually say. So it's a new moment. So I'm happy to just share, it's a new moment. Folks are interested in working together in a much more authentic way. It's not easy. It's not easy. And there's still this, the real fundamental questions of, resources and institutional power, and then who gets seen as credible leadership. But I think at least there's a way now that we can actually be talking to each other in a very different way.
All right, I think Jackie wants to ask a question.
Do you have time to stay on and hear two questions, Cindy, or are you running off?
No. I'm good. I'm good. Yeah.
She's avoiding.
Okay. Well, one quick question. I'm curious. I know that when you talk about, kind of piggybacking off her question about trying to diversify the movement. Statistically, looking at impacted communities, we can't always count on those particular impacted communities being multicultural, or, I'm curious if particular nations don't necessarily have and aren't necessarily agricultural by nature, because I would assume that a nation that depends on their land for their economy or for their livelihood would be more interested in the environmental movement, because that is their livelihood. So for America, they're not as committed to their land, because they're not necessarily depended on it for their livelihood, how would you approach them if it's not, if the community isn't necessarily impacted by some environmental disaster? There are so many industrialized nations, and those industrialized nations may have communities that tend to, or environmental movements that tend to be less minority, or statistically have less minorities.
So yeah, so a couple things on that. I think that there's just, part of living in the United States and what we call, sort of developing countries is that there's been always a purposeful, disconnection to land. And in a lot of ways, many of us, a good chunk of people and children growing up don't even know where their food comes from, right? And I think that that's been generally a trend in this country, sort of just a historic kind of intentional sort of sort of cutting out that relationship between people and land. And, but I think that there's also been a lot of movements like, the right to the city movement that has, taking on the issue of anti-eviction or even the right to against displacement that has begun to talk about like, what is our right to the commons? What's our right to live in the city? What's our right to be here? And so I think, and then we've seen pretty strong farmer and campesino movements in which we folks have been talking about, well, hey, your food does come from, from here, and I think we need to, or in Detroit, a huge, ginormous food. Food justice movement and agroecology movement that we're seeing all over. So I think that question is not so black and white, in terms of, so I think there is this kind of growing movement of reconnection back to land, reconnection back to how we even grow our food in a localized way, principles of food sovereignty that folks are really applying. But to say to that, I think that one of the things is that, I think people, most people are going to get around climate, are going to come to it. And I think this is true in all organizing because they're impacted by it. So, it's like sometimes when we do worker organizing is that because someone has been unjustly treated in their workplace. And so that's something, there's a self-interest in a lot of ways, right? When we sometimes do organizing or in a community when we're doing work around, around a policy or something, it's because they're directly impacted. And so I think the thing that I think is going to be really powerful for us to talk about is that, what we saw as something kind of catastrophic like Katrina, as, people could see as like a one-time event, like more and more was like what we're seeing is like the droughts in California. We're seeing the floods in Colorado. We're seeing, Superstorm Sandy and then Hurricane Irene. We're seeing more and more of these kind of catastrophic events, not just be these one-time events, but then impacting communities in a way which I think is actually a good entry point into talking to people about what climate change is. And I think it's based on their like seeing its impact, in their, the lack of water or whatever in a particular community because it's being polluted because of the oil spill, in their water source. And so I think that's going to be a really important hook, what I would call a hook in terms of trying to talk to people about that, or it's like, what is this, the polar vortex, the weather extremes, being able to talk to people about what that may mean. I think another thing, it's interesting, at least for my family, and this is probably more with Catholics or something, like the Pope actually coming out and saying things about climate change has actually been something incredibly interesting to talk to, like it's putting climate change, all these, Catholics are now beginning to explore, well, what does this climate change mean? And why is the Pope talking about it? And so I think there's things like that happen in society that I think we need to be able to sort of grab onto that impacts like kind of mass culture to be those entry points to talk to our families, to talk to our friends, to talk to people in our communities that would, at one point sort of see it as distant or not impacting them.
All right.
Can I close out?
Yeah, Jackie wants to ask a question.
Sydney, thank you so much for all your really poignant observations here. But you mentioned that you were at the Cochabamba conference, the World People's Conference on Climate Change in 2010. And That document is on our website. We've asked people to read it, so maybe some folks have read it. But I wonder if you can share with us, have you seen that document help lead to some action since 2010 when it was formed, or are there ideas in there that can be particularly useful for people trying to organize and build movements for climate justice?
Mm-hmm. I think it's one of those things that it's one of those documents that I would say, I mentioned this earlier. It's a blueprint, right? It has actual feedback on how to deal with climate, right? How to reduce emissions, how to be able to deal with forest and the protection of forest, how to deal with questions of agriculture, and it also has some pieces around like for different sort of sectors, like the impact on women, the impact on farm workers, campesinos, the impact on indigenous peoples. And so I think in a lot of ways, I would say it's a document that's a living document that I think a lot of us refer to and build on as a way to be able to, it's almost like a compass, right? A kind of a political moral compass. I was there and, really saw like there was 35,000 people there from all over the world, and a lot of indigenous people from the Andean region, and a lot of folks from social movements from all over the world. And I think it really reflected, and people were part of writing, spent like days and nights kind of writing this document. And so I think if there is an example of something that kind of was bottom up, that's a good thing to point to. And I don't know of anything that has ever been done like that historically or since then, that I feel like but I think unfortunately it was supposed to be kind of the rallying sort of point articulation that we were going to take to the UN climate negotiations in Cancun and later of that year in 2010. And I think that just many things, the movement kind of fragmented for many reasons. Bolivia got left alone by all the ALBA countries. And I think in a lot of ways, it's like we didn't know how to build on that momentum, and it was also, some people from the movements were also critical that it was a state, it was like a government that held that process. And so I just think that there was things that I see it as a good almost baseline of a real good articulation of the politics, like kind of, I would say, very liberatory, very transformative kind of vision. And I think it's something that we need to keep sort of referring to and building on.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thanks again, Cindy, for coming. There I am in the screen. Okay, so thank you again.
Yes.